Dalia Fahmy, who is the Director of International Relations and an Associate Professor of Political Science at Long Island University. Always a pleasure to have you on, Dalia. Has this happened sooner than you expected, this breakthrough in Sharm el-Sheikh?
You know, when we saw the names of who's going to attend, that Jared Kushner, the President Trump's son-in-law, that Steve Witkoff was going to be there, that the Israeli Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer was going there, but that the Prime Minister of Qatar himself was going to be there, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman al-Jassim al-Thani, that Hamas leadership was going to be there, those that survived the attempted assassinations, and that they brought with them other Palestinian voices. It signaled that something was going to happen. So what we see today is that 2 million Palestinians are waking up, perhaps without hearing the drones overhead for the first time in 731 days. But we don't know much more beyond that. We don't know what the next phases will look like. We know that perhaps by Monday, there will be a prisoner exchange that has not yet been agreed upon. But what we have not talked about yet or seen the details of is what Palestinian statehood will look like, what governance is going to look like, who's going to be in charge, who's going to lay out the plan for the future. Will there be Palestinians allowed to return back to the north? We know that Israel has put several lines, and that even if we look at what was seen a little bit in the 20-point plan was that there was never going to be a complete withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, that the territories surrounding the water and, for example, towards Egypt, were going to continue to be maintained by Israel. And so these are really important details that we have yet to know. So, of course, Palestinians enjoy the reprieve of today and rejoice. However, this does not make for a peace plan.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very, very important, isn't it? The moment, the celebration, the silence that hopefully we will hear soon, because last we heard, Dalia, was that the attacks were continuing during the night. But the future of this deal, does it almost appear to you as if it's kind of both sides signing or agreeing to something that they don't totally believe gives them what they wanted just a few months ago? In other words, they feel the pressure of the world and that they just want to get to a moment which might provide a longer-term solution. But right now, it doesn't necessarily, and it appears to be temporary just to stop the killings.
Yes, and it seems like the critical variable, if you will, is President Trump putting his thumb on the scale. You know, it's not lost on all of us that, for example, on Friday, the Nobel Committee will announce the Nobel Peace Prize winners, and we know that that's really important to President Trump. That he wants his, Oslo Accord photo op, if you will, as we saw with President Clinton and Yasser Arafat and Ishaq Rabin. And so there is that factor of the urgency. However, it's not clear that there won't be an abrogation of ceasefire. You and I have talked about ceasefire deals in the past and the violation of ceasefire deals. We've had phase 1 and phase 2, and they've all been violated. If we even look at the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah, it's been violated 2,000 times. And so, again, until the details are laid out in a way that talks about who will govern, what is this Blair project really all about? What does it mean for us to talk about a supervisory, administrative, international group of individuals who also have vested financial interests? These are really important for us to figure out. What is the security of Palestinians going to look like? What is the security of the Gaza Strip going to look like? And so, yes, this might be a moment where there has been too much suffering so that Benjamin Netanyahu needed to address the internal pressure, especially given the critical moment of releasing hostages, but also that Hamas, it's become clear that holding hostages does not give them any leverage. Rather, releasing hostages and seeing if the Israeli right-wing government that has been saying that the goal is to get all the hostages back and that would end the violence, that they actually adhere to that. And so perhaps they're both playing their cards, and we have to wait and see what the rest of this peace plan and its phases are going to look like. Will there be a conversation about governance, about perhaps Arab countries' involvement? What does it mean for Palestinians? Are we going to talk about a one-state or a two-state or a federated system? These are questions that are really critical. Will they be allowed to return to the north? We know that right now they haven't been, but we also know that just last March, there was a ceasefire deal where Palestinians returned and they had to return back to the south. And so, of course, we'll take the moment for what it is. We'll take the reprieve. We'll take, of course, the release of hostages from Israel and from Gaza and from Hamas. But also, there has to be a deeper understanding of what the rest of the phases are going to look like. What does this mean for the plight of the Palestinian people and ultimately for Palestinian statehood?
Yes, because as people were saying over the past 2 years, that you can't defeat Hamas. Hamas is a philosophy. Hamas is more than an individual with a weapon. Hamas is a way of thinking, of resisting a longer-term occupation. And therefore, what is the future of Hamas? It says it had been saying that it wouldn't lay down its arms until the occupation withdrew from Gaza completely. That now looks unlikely because Benjamin Netanyahu wants to keep the military in a certain place, which would still possibly compromise the independence of Gaza. And Hamas is a force, wants its philosophy to exist beyond its current iteration as the governors of Gaza, right, Dalia? Wherever they go, they want to be there as a force.
But the Hamas of today is nowhere what it was 2 years ago. It's weakened strategically, it's weakened militarily, and it's weakened in its composition. And the fact that Hamas took with them members of Islamic Jihad, they took members of different Palestinian factions with them to Sharm el-Sheikh, means that they knew they no longer had the voice of the Palestinian people, that there were other voices that needed to be brought to the table for this negotiation. There was a study that was conducted, the Arab Barometer Project. They collected their last data on October 6th of 2023, exactly one day before the mass violence on the festival by Hamas on Israeli civilians and population. Just one day before it, and what the data revealed was that 76% of the inhabitants of Gaza no longer wanted Hamas in power. And that between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, about 90% of the residents of Gaza wanted neither. And so what we saw in that data was that the residents of Gaza actually wanted a level of self-autonomy away from the old vestiges of political structure and of ideology. So I'm not sure that the average Gazan actually wants Hamas in power. Rather, I think signaling what the folks that went with Hamas to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, signals that perhaps their popularity is nowhere near where people think it is and nowhere near where they want it to be. And so perhaps we're looking at a different watershed moment. And if we look at that data from October 6th of 2023, this has been long coming. And so I've always thought that perhaps had we had an election on October 7th rather than this attack, then we could have seen a different outcome where the Palestinian people would have chose their own governance, those who rule them, and we would have seen Hamas actually out of power through the electoral ballot.
Dalia, to look even further into the future, there is going to be the longer-term issue of justice, the justice that many in the world want to see delivered. We know that the ICC has arrest warrants out for Benjamin Netanyahu, for former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. We know the ICJ case about the genocide being conducted in Gaza. This will weigh heavily on Israeli society for years to come.
We have to learn the lessons of other places, for example, of Rwanda, and what happens when conflict comes to an end. For example, I'm talking about Rwanda 1994, when there has to be a level of transitional justice and accountability to actually move and build towards the future. It's not clear that there's even been a conversation about this really with the international community. We know it's come out through the UN agencies and bodies, but in order for us to really talk about building for the future, then transitional justice has to occur. There has to be accountability, and perhaps at some place, a level of reparations and rebuilding costs that has to take place from the Israeli government and Israeli society. And so if we think about what this means in terms of moving forward, in order for us to really talk about peace and peace building and peacemaking towards the future, we have to envision a future where there are going to be monuments and memorials erected to honor all of the Gazan civilians who have fallen because of this 2-year time period. It's been 731 days, and this has been, in terms of violence, it's been the longest in the modern era. We've seen the most intense violence, 31 times more than the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on a territory that's 1/3 of that territory. And so the level of violence, the level of death, we have yet to really understand and see, because, as you know, journalists are not allowed into the territories. There haven't been fact-finding missions, information gathering. That's all going to lead to perhaps real accountability if it's allowed to occur. And that has to be contained in these peace plans, because there's even, for example, in just war theory, there is justice in the ending of wars, and there's justice towards the building towards the future. If that doesn't occur, then I'm unfortunately pessimistic about where this is going to take us.
How much of an international effort now needs to come together to take care of the 2.1, 2.2 million Palestinians who are there living in an absolutely destroyed territory? And we all see the pictures, the amount of time it will take to rebuild Gaza and the future of the people of the enclave while that's happening. How much of an international effort does this need to be? Who's going to provide most of the money? Who's going to provide the leadership? Where's that all going to come from? There's so many things that are unclear.
But, it's become clear is that if we're going to be committed to a liberal world order based on justice and human rights, then the international community has to come together. Because if we don't, then we signal to the world that mass death, killing, and impunity in the conduct of warfare is fundamentally acceptable. And so this is going to be a watershed moment, a turning point. And as we saw in the beginning of the violence that Israel brought down on Gaza to punish after October 7th, what we saw was that the international community became led in this voice by the Global South. And when the Global South become the leader of the kind of liberal world order, of those that are advocating for human rights, of international justice, of accountability, then it begs the question of who's going to lead towards the future. This has to be an international coming together, because it's a watershed moment for the future of the international community, the role of the United Nations, and accountability, and signaling to the rest of the world that impunity is unacceptable. In terms of building, we will have to see a heavy involvement of Arab states, and perhaps beyond that, because this is not going to occur very simply. 90% of the infrastructure has been destroyed. There's not a single school or university left. Most of the housing has been destroyed, and most of the medical infrastructure has been destroyed. And so the rebuilding is going to be necessarily if we're really going to be building towards peace, stability, and ultimately a Palestinian statehood.
Dalia Fahmy, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.